History of Church of Santa Costanza and Architecture of Santa Costanza. Subscribed by my YouTube channel, Golden Words. History of Church of Santa Costanza. Santa Costanza was built as the mausoleum, or martyria, of the daughter of the Emperor Constantine, Constantia, Costanza, who died in 354. As was commonly the case for Roman mausolea, although on a grander scale than is usual, this was a centrally planned circular building that originally had at its center, beneath the dome, the porphyry tombs of Constantia and her sister, Helena, later removed to the Vatican museums. The building adjoins the nave of the Basilica of Sant'Agnese, to whom Constantia had a particular devotion. The circular design of the building is especially striking on the interior, where two concentric rings of 24 paired, freestanding, granite columns with an architrave on composite capitals separate the central space from a barrel-vaulted ambulatory. Rising above the central volume is a large ribbed dome 74 feet (22.5 meters) in diameter, built using a technique similar to that of the Pantheon. It is likely that the design inspired the martyria of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, commissioned by Constantine and his mother, Helena. Santa Costanza is richly decorated with mosaics, some of the earliest from the Christian era to survive, although many of these have been lost over the centuries, and only a few of the New Testament scenes survive. However, it is the exquisite decorative panels and frames in the ambulatory, showing interwoven crosses, foliage, and geometrical patterns, as well as vines with putti that are most striking. The mausoleum was consecrated as a church in 1254 by Pope Alexander IV and is still in use today. Architecture. Structure. Santa Costanza is a circular, centralized structure, with a circular ambulatory ringing a high central space topped by a shallow dome, which is raised on a round drum, as can be seen from the exterior. It is built of brick-faced concrete and its structure is basically two rings supported by columns placed around a vertical central axis. The upper ring sits on the columns while the lower ring encloses a circular ambulatory whose space flows between the columns into the axial cylinder. This design essentially creates two spaces or two worlds, that of the ambulatory and that of the upper dome. The screens of the ambulatory and inner ring create a dark contrast to the bright upper space of the dome. This contrast of light can be seen in the picture of the main interior. The single door, flanked by two arched niches, would originally have been an internal arch or doorway leading straight into the Constantinian basilica or funerary hall, halfway along its length. There is a short vestibule inside the door, opening to the ambulatory. An arched arcade with 12 pairs of granite columns decorated with composite capitals supports the drum below the dome, and separates the area of the ambulatory beyond, which is much darker, as light from 12 windows in the clerestory does not reach this area as well. In contrast, the central area is well lit, creating interplay between dark and light in the interior. The number of arches, pairs of columns and windows could be a reference to the 12 apostles. Opposite the entrance in this central space there is, a kind of baldacchino, rises above a porphyry plaque which, below the middle arch of the center room, once seems to have carried the princess's sarcophagus. This is where the sarcophagus of Constantina, or perhaps the second one, would have rested. The ambulatory is barrel-vaulted and is 22.5 meters or 74 feet in diameter. The ambulatory has most of the surviving mosaics in the church. Larger arches mark the cardinal points in the mausoleum. The walls were probably covered in slabs of colorful marble, as was usual in imperial buildings. Santa Costanza was also to some extent a new type of building. It was different from earlier styles in that the roof, which would previously have been typically flat and made with wood, was instead designed as a dome and vault. Mosaics. The mosaics of Santa Costanza are important examples of early Christian art, and even rarer examples of secular palace ceiling mosaics. The apses, central dome, and ambulatory all had mosaic decoration, though that in the dome no longer survives. As evidenced by surviving Renaissance-era illustrations, the church was likely once covered with mosaic decoration, but today all that remains are those in the two apses and those in the ring barrel vault. In particular, The ring vault mosaics are well preserved and consist of 11 divisions of ornamental motifs, some of which are repeated. The mosaics here were composed using pieces of marble, unlike the composition using glass cubes that would become popular in later works. The use of color is significant as the mosaics encompass a narrow range of colors including dark green, brown, red and yellow on a relatively plain light backdrop. This color scheme is comparable to earlier Roman mosaic compositions of the first half of the 4th century and dates these compositions to very soon after the completion of the structure as opposed to being later additions. Mosaics in the apses. In the ambulatory wall there are 2 shallow apses, each with a mosaic showing Christ as the Pantocrator, the earliest surviving examples of this depiction. They probably date to the 5th or 7th century, though there has been much discussion of this. Like many mosaics of the period, both have suffered from restoration and both show elements of Roman imperial imagery, representing early examples of the conflation of this with Christian art. A mosaic with 2 women wearing white, reported as being behind the sarcophagus in the Renaissance, has now gone and was never drawn. One of the apses shows a Traditio Legis. Christ is shown with Saints Peter and Paul giving Peter the scroll representing law, with the inscription, Dominus pacem dat, or, the Lord is giving peace. A few sheep represent his role as shepherd governing and leading his flock. Christ is clothed in golden robes, suggesting his power and supremacy. He is shown rising above paradise, which further shows his dominance over both heaven and earth. In the second apse, Christ appears somewhat more simply but still as supremely powerful. His robes are not quite as rich as in the other apse, but still suggest power. He wears a simple tunic but it is purple and gold. This suggests not only holy power, but human power given that purple is the color of royalty and the gold stripe suggestion a connection to the Roman emperors. Peter also approaches Christ in supplication, like one would approach the emperor. This is one of the first examples in Christian art of Christ being portrayed in the same way as the emperor or royalty. It is a concept that would later be prevalent in Christian art and architecture. In this apse Christ is not just portrayed as royalty but as the ruler of the world, of all existence. He sits atop a blue sphere, a clear symbol for the world or universe. From this perch he hands keys to Peter. This is a clear sign of Christ, and the power of heaven, giving authority and holy power to man. It is also important to note that Peter was Rome's first bishop, so this meant Roman authority was sanctioned by God. This concept and picture of Christ as the almighty ruler and creator of the world would be the norm in the artwork of later churches, but it first appears here at Santa Costanza. Mosaics in the ambulatory. The 4th century mosaics on the ambulatory vault are contemporary with the building, and show a stark contrast to those in the apses, being essentially secular in appearance and make no obvious Christian allusions. The surface area of many of these mosaic panels is occupied by a profusion of vine and plant ornament as well as containing geometric patterns, small heads or figures within compartmented frames, birds with branches of foliage, vases and other objects. The 5th and 8th panels depict circles with alternating floral and figurative designs, and panel 6 displays representations of boughs and greenery accompanied by birds and vessels. These naturalistic ornaments suggest to the viewer ideas of beauty and abundance and reflect the decorations found in early Christian catacombs, suggesting a theme of the promise of beauty and abundance to be found in heaven following a Christian death. Significantly, one particular panel is especially pagan in character and depicts grapevine scrolls accompanied by cupids picking grapes and crafting them into wine, a depiction that seems to recall Bacchus, the Roman god of wine. It was because of the predominance of this imagery that during the Renaissance period the building came to be known as the Tempio di Bacco and believed to have a pagan origin. This type of scene also appears on Constantina's sarcophagus, as it does on the ends of the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus. The pagan appearance of such images of grapes, fruit, birds, and mythological figures represent the period of transition between paganism to Christianity that was taking place in Rome at this time. Baksheesh motifs were often used in the funerary monuments of late antiquity, and although a decided religious shift was taking place in Rome, it would be logical that some traditional imagery would persist and be adopted by the new tradition. The theme continues in the floor mosaics, which were similar in style to those in the ambulatory, filled with cupids, birds, and Bacchus and grapevines. This may reflect the merging of pagan and Christian values in Rome, or alternatively construction under the non-Christian Julian. These mosaics probably represent the sort of decoration found in the imperial palaces of the period, and in general have needed little restoration. Central Dome. The mosaics of the Central Dome no longer exist, but a picture of them can still be reconstructed as between 1538 and 1540 Francisco de Holanda made watercolor copies of what then survived. In these several biblical scenes appear, resembling catacomb paintings from the 3rd century, including Susanna and the elders, Tobias, the sacrifice of Cain and Abel, the sacrifice of Elias on Mount Carmel, possibly Lot receiving the angels, Moses striking the rock for water, and possibly even Noah building the ark. The upper row of mosaics, largely missing by the 16th century, is thought to have had scenes from the New Testament, since it has the miracle of the centurion. These mosaics have caryatids and acantha scrolls and a calendar of saints in the upper row. This, in conjunction with the 2 apses, is where the majority of Christian imagery occurs. Sarcophagi. Sarcophagus of Constantina, Vatican museums, originally stood in the mausoleum. 2 large porphyry sarcophagi from the church are now in the Vatican, the larger and more famous, illustrated, in the Vatican museums, where it was moved during the late 18th century and is on display. The smaller was moved in St. Peter's itself, left transept, in 1606. It is now thought that the larger sarcophagus traditionally related to Constantina may in fact have housed her sister Helena, and the less spectacular one, also removed to the Vatican, was actually Constantina's. Constantina's sarcophagus has complex symbolic designs in relief. The surface is dominated by an intricate pattern of stylized vine stems into which are fitted cherubs, with this scene of Dionysiac exuberance, and the hope of future blessedness which it implies. 2 peacocks, birds of immortality, are completely in accord. The scene presents an image of nature and plenty complete with grapevines, sheep and birds. The putti are framed in acantha scrolls, above which there are several images of masks. Aside from the natural scene, there are also 4 portraits including Constantia herself, on the lid, 4 graceful portrait heads, one apparently that of Constantina, look calmly out over this assurance that the best is yet to be. The imagery presented of wine and nature are not inherently Christian but could be perceived as such considering the use of wine in the Eucharist, or they could be perceived as a connection to Bacchus, the god of wine. This style of sarcophagus would cease to be used in Rome by the end of the 4th century, and this sarcophagus of Constantia is a prime example of the style. The sarcophagus is massive with the chest measuring 128 centimeters or 4 feet 23/8 in high, 233 centimeters or 7 feet 71/2 in long, and 157 centimeters or 5 feet 13/4 in wide. It is made of porphyry, a hard purple stone, reserved by the Romans for use only by the imperial family, whose color purple was. It was quarried from only one place, Mons Porphyriticus, Coptos, Egypt, making it even more exclusive. It appears, but cannot be certain, that the sarcophagus of Constantina is a copy of that of Constantine I, her father, which is now lost. A piece of what is believed to be his sarcophagus is similar in style and of the same material. A cast replica has been placed in the church, though in the ambulatory. Presumably its original position was in the center of the church, now occupied by the altar. There is another in the Museum of Roman Civilization in the city.